Good afternoon. My name is Isabel Rohr. I'm the Manager of Academic Programs and Outreach at JDC Archives. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar in the context of the Max and Cecil Stower Chassin JDC Archives Fellowship. I'd like to start today's program by saying a few words about JDC Archives. JDC Archives holds the records of JDC since its creation about 107 years ago. As such, it is one of the most important repositories for the study of modern Jewish history. Scholars from around the world, as well as family researchers, journalists, filmmakers, use our collections for their research. We also offer fellowships to enable scholars to conduct research in our archives. As I mentioned earlier, today's webinar is organized in the context of the Max and Cecil Stower Chassin JDC Archives Fellowship. That fellowship was established in 2017 thanks to a generous gift from Dr. Saul and Lauren Chassin to honor Saul Chassin's parents. Saul and Lauren Chassin are supporters of JDC Archives with a long-term commitment to academic excellence and research. I want to extend our thanks to Saul and Lauren Chassin for the generosity in endowing this fellowship as well as two other fellowships in JDC Archives. Our speaker today, Dr. Lorena Cardona Gonzalez, was awarded the Max and Cecil Stower Chassin JDC Archives Fellowship in 2021. Dr. Lorena Cardona Gonzalez is a professor in the Faculty of Social and Legal Sciences at the Universidad de Caldas in Colombia. She earned her PhD in history and her MA in history and memory from the Universidad de La Plata in Argentina. She was also a postdoctoral fellow in history at the Universidad de La Plata in Argentina. Dr. Cardona Gonzalez is the recipient of numerous fellowships, including, of course, the JDC Archives Fellowship, but also the Judith B. and Burton Resnick Postdoctoral Fellowship at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Her research focused on representation of the Holocaust in Colombia, the history of Jewish and German migration in Colombia during World War II, and the post-war treatment of Jewish refugees from Nazism. The title of her lecture today is not Undesirable, but Unnecessary Jewish Refugees from Nazism in Colombia in 1945-1950. Our format is that she will talk for about 45 minutes. This will be followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. You can send us questions via the Q&A function on Zoom because your microphones are muted. And you can send us your questions at any time during the lecture. Dr. Lorena Cardona Gonzalez will now start her lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. And good afternoon to the people who are listening this moment, and thank you for attending this webinar. The first one, I would like to say thank you, of course, to the JDC Archives for this opportunity provided through this fellowship and for support my postdoctoral research. And of course, I'm grateful to Max and Cecil Stower Chassin JDC Archives. And also, I will say thank you to Isabel Rohr for her orientation in my digital archive and for your help in this webinar, for her suggestion and correction in my text and an English presentation, for the technical team, and for all the people who make possible this lecture. And for the first moment, I will share my screen. Okay. The name of this webinar, as Isabel said, is not Undesirable but Unnecessary Jewish Refugee from Nazis in Colombia, 1945 and 1915. The purpose of this lecture is try to demonstrate how Colombia was among the Latin American country sustained the discriminatory measure limiting the entry of immigrants or imposing economic and bureaucratic obstacles. Arguments about religious, economic, political, and cultural difference of the Jews were used by the Colombian government to prevent the entry of the Jewish refugee in the country. With decrees, legislations, and other JDC archives that I talked to the New York archives, I try to explain two ways of what I use the documentation about the two different topics. The first one include documents related to the Jewish immigration in Colombia between 1945 and 1953, and the role of the Jewish aid and relief institution in Colombia. The second part of this presentation talk about the JDC archives materials that talk about the la violencia or the civil war that took place in Colombia since 1948. My hypothesis is that this civil war made the arrival of the new immigrants and the re-immigration of those already residing in the country almost impossible. And as we could see, campaigns for aid and assistance of the Jewish community in Europe began in Colombia before the war. Several organizations of the national level were part of this commission and relief and assistance to the European Jewish migrants, among them the Montefiore Israelite Association, the Hebrew Relief Society in Bogota, the Committee for the Protection of the Israel Immigrants in ports of Barranquilla and Buenaventura, and the Hebrew Federal Union in Cali, which brought together the most important Jewish community or the Jewish population centers in Colombia. And the most of his work in the first moment was focused on connect with the national government to obtain visas, work permissions, and migratory commission that sought to establish Jewish settlements in rural and urban areas. This intense activity of this organization ended in 1941, when the arrival of the new immigrants became almost impossible due to the worsenings of the conflict at the rupture of the relations with between Colombia and Germany after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. From this day, the Colombian Jewish community began to document the tragedy of the co-religionists in Europe. For instance, has showed the report to the El Tiempo, a national journal, in December 1942, a worldwide commemoration of mourning was held when the confirmation of the extermination of the Jews by Nazism was revealed. And only with the end of the war in 1945, their activity was restarted with other objectives: the search for survival and legal procedures for reception to refugee to Colombia. These groups also helped in the collection of funds and material aid to send to Europe. Another of their initial tasks at the end of the war was to establish contact with the organization in New York or even in Paris, such as the American Joint Distribution Committee, to look for possible survivors in Europe or provide assistance to the people who had relatives in Colombia and wanted to emigrate there. For instance, among the documents that can be found in the JDC archives, we could read some letters that reveal the uncertainty and the search for survival, or even the revelation of appalling news about the whereabouts of relatives in Europe. In this case, the first letter is a reply to Beno Hess, who searched his sister, Hilda Hess, who is born in Gerov on May 31st in 1905. And the letter says that she was taken from Gurs to Drancy on August 8 in 1943, and 4 days later was deported from Drancy, probably to Auschwitz. In the second letter, they reflect the impossibility to effective communication due to the absence of the data or the uncertain location of family members in Colombia. The letter said, Jeremy, we have learned through the Lublin radio broadcast that Rosia Fragdenrad from Radom Butheim from Radom have survived and sent greetings to their relatives in Colombia. We regret that there were no names and addresses given of the relatives in your country, but we hope that will be possible for you to locate them. In an effort to help in the identification and location of the immigrants, the local Jewish community unsuccessfully sought the approval of the national political figures to obtain entry of hundreds of refugees. While the gesture of goodwill and mutual benefit generate expectation, they did not lead to any effective immigration measures. For instance, we could see a news to the Jewish Telegraphy Agency for a fake news about to Colombia report to willing to admit 1,000 Jewish families from Europe. Of course, this information was fake. In order to correct this misinformation, the National Refuge Service and the Joint prepared a third country manual on immigration, which document precisely what requirements Colombia would impose on immigrants. The informative memorandum was issued on January 15, 1947, confirmed that while Colombia was complete opposed to the immigration of the Jewish refugees, its immigration legislation was quite complex. The report states that the Colombian laws guarantee the liberty of professional activities to foreigners who come with visa, but the immigrant must dedicate himself to that occupation which he declares his first registration with the national police. Every change of occupation has to be authorized by the police. Furthermore, concerning to the practice of liberal professions, revalidation of titles and diplomas is practically impossible for physicians and dentists. Finally, in the naturalization process, the report declared that although technically foreigners can be naturalized after 5 years of residence, it's practically speaking extremely difficult, and few immigrants have succeeded in obtaining this naturalization. 3 elements were highlighted in the report as problematic for immigrants: the cost of immigration deposits or landing bonds, visa application documents, and transits on tourist visa. First, as the document states, the cost of immigration deposit varied according to the nationality, the number of relatives, and their age. National or bordering countries of Colombia must deposit 50 pesos. National of other countries of the American continent, 500 pesos. All other foreigners older than 21 years, 1,000 pesos. And other foreigners younger than 21 years, 500 pesos. In addition, the cost of a visa to Colombia was to the equivalent to $1,500, which meant that coming to Colombia was substantially expensive. Furthermore, the Colombian consul requests numerous of documents which in most cases were impossible to obtain for the majority of war victims and refugees, such as a certificate of a good character and behavior for the past 10 years, certificate of good health, and certificate of vaccination, a certificate stating if the applicant is married or single, as well as passport, identity certificate, or a special authorization, and a titre de voyage in the case of applicants in Paris and Marseille. Lastly, regarding to transits and tourist visa, the Minister of Foreign Affairs will only grant transit visas without difficulty to persons possessing immigration visas for countries bordering Colombia, and that with such visa, the applicant could not eventually be transformed into immigration visas during the stay in Colombia. Regarding to immigration deposit, is are most the frequent document that I found in the JDC folders. As an example, we have as an example of the difficulties of this tax implying both to the migrants and the sponsors, we have the under subject Findelstein, Samuel, Helen, and Annette, and Lessing Marek. It was documented that the above name have arrived at the port of the Barranquilla on June 30 on the SS Catomba. Upon the arrival, the Colombian authorities asked them for $1,485, which means 3,000 pesos, for an immigrant deposit, money which of course the immigrants didn't have. The relatives and sponsors, Max and Mary Vicentals, resident of New York, were intervened by the local committees of the United Service for the New Americans. They indicate that they had paid $1,500 for the Colombian visa. It was their understanding that the entry deposit would not have to be paid because the visa had been secured based on the labor contract. Although the problem was finally solved by the joint, which provided with a loan, this is one of the many cases that reveal the obstacles that immigrants face, not only at the ports of departure, but also to the ports of arrival. This is an example to the landing bonds for immigration for immigrants in Colombia, different loans that the JDC provide to the immigrants to came in the country. In addition, the Colombian government established selective migration policies from 1947 onwards on the semblance of a greater migratory flexibility. Legislation 161 of 1948 create an administrative department of immigration and colonization that intend to carry out a migration of refugees more controlled and focused. In this case, the predilection of migrants farming was extended to prominent technicians or industry experts, artists, intellectuals, or renowned professional or skilled workers whose visas will be granted with exception from the immigration deposit. However, the misleading thing about the legislation is that privilege family groups from Spain, Italy, Switzerland, Germany, Hungary, and those other countries whose natives are considered more likely to adapt to our environment. It's mean, preferably Catholic immigrants, which once again confirm the interdiction of the Jewish immigration, which seriously affect a large number of victims of the Holocaust. Arguments related to the incompatibility of Jewish refugees dominate the official rhetoric. In an article in the local newspaper El Tiempo, Cosas del Día of 1947, it was stated that Colombia lacked a clear system in its immigration policy. The article said, we have lacked a selective sense of immigration, which is perfectly compatible with our democratic conditions. We have lacked vigilance in the fulfillment by many immigrants, once they had settled in the country, of their promise regarding professional activities. We have lacked foresight for the request of certain immigration and the offer to the same ones of flattering facilities. All these deficiencies added to the effort that certain elements, not undesirable but necessary, made to enter the country, have prevented us from taking advantage for the eagerness to emigrate that now drives many excellent human European groups. If we need certain immigration, let us look for it, but with a practical sense that the chaotic circumstances of today's world will also be human. This will allow us to avoid at least certain multitudinous and undiscernible immigration, which will benefit us very little and which are precisely those that provoke misgivings, alarms, and confusion, inconvenience for our universal democratic prestige. The alarms, inconvenience, and confusion that the author of the article referred to allude to the argument that the Jewish immigration in Colombia will lead to strong economic competition in the commerce sector. Fears of Jewish economic competition were not just limited to rhetoric in the nationalist and conservative press. For example, in 1946, the Jewish commerce in Bogota was attacked and boycotted under the argument of unfair competition and the application of sale methods that affect the good faith and incomes of Bogota clients. The riots caused a balance of 44 destroyed stores, and according to the American Jewish Committee, some Jews were beaten. The image that we could see represent these events in 1946. Some of them we could see people watching the broken showcase, and the other we could see posters that say we are Colombian, or this store does not belong Poles, the common name to the Colombia gave to the Jewish community in Colombia. The other affair, famous affair about the Exodus shipment was related with Colombia. On July 16, in 1947, 4,500 Jewish willing to escape to the Nazi gas chamber and crematorium arrived in truck to the French port of Sète and embarked on the Exodus. Although the real purpose was to travel to Palestine, they claimed to sail thanks for a Colombia visas. As the ship approached to Palestine, the British Navy moved in to seize it. The passenger resisted, and as a result, 120 were wounded and 5 died. The travelers wanted to send the 4,500 Jews to Colombia, taking into account that the French authorities allowed embarkation because they saw the consular visas of this country. In response, the Colombian embassy in France declared, "It's absolutely important that all or most of this group of Jews be in possession of Colombian visas or passports." Confirming Colombia's restrictive migration policies, the Colombian embassy also declared that the Colombian consulate in Marseille stated that since May 1946, it had only issued 112 visas. A spokesman of the embassy confirmed that if indeed the Jews had sought severely Colombian visas, it's because they have been falsified. Arguments regarding Jewish economic competitions remain a decisive factor in the guaranteeing visas. The response of the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Carlos Holguín, confirmed that the function of authorizing the consul to issue collective visa had no pass through this office, much less for people who could be tried professionals, because the government, giving an account of the serious competition exercised against Colombian merchants, had totally restricted the migration of these elements. Following the international scandal and given the possible arrival of the 4,500 Jews of the Exodus to Colombia, the national newspaper El Tiempo surveyed whether should 4,500 Jews who have visa in France to be allowed to enter the country. Most of the answers, even those in favor, expressed a concern about the inconvenience to the economic competition that this migrant would represent. There is a discourse of a new immigration to Colombia, said El Tiempo. What do you think our young people, and not our statement, about this problem? Bernardo Valderrama doesn't believe in the need for this immigration. Mister, do you believe that the Jewish immigrants should be allowed to enter the country? The 4,500 who say they are coming? Well, I don't think so. Why not? Because they take over all the businesses. Another one that supports immigration, Mr. Hernando Martinez, sorry. Do you consider it convenient they come to the country of the Jewish immigrant? Yes, but if they come as a farmers. And if they come to put a warehouse? Well, also because they teach to negotiate. They have the techniques to sell cheap and to sell all the people that is necessary to learn it. At the end, in April of that year, of the 4,500 crew members of the Exodus, 2,600 Jewish refugees managed to leave France, but their final destination was Honduras. Once again, the possibility of entry into Colombian proved difficult and negligent, even in the eyes of the international community. The other part that I like to, sorry, the other part that I would like to talk is about the violence in Colombia. The afternoon on April 9th in 1948 changed almost completely the physical and symbolic appearance of the city of Bogota, Colombia. The events that precede one of the greatest social crises in national history were framed in the brutal assassination of the liberal political leader Jorge Eliezer Gaitán. Gaitán, an emerging politician from the popular sectors, embodied the rhetoric and ideas of those not included in the productive sector, a population nucleus that did not have a permanent job, did not benefit from the public service, such as education, and trust in his distributive political vision and his charismatic character. Days before his death, Gaitán recognized that his life was at risk and predicted that if he was defeated or if something happened to me, there will be no stone upon stone in this country. And it happened like that. Gaitán was hit with 3 revolver bullets the day the projectile had set on his skull. Lying on the street with barely any vital signs, he was rushed to the central clinic. In the afternoon, the news of the attacks had spread throughout Bogota, and hundreds of his followers came to the scene full of pain and terror. This scene of popular confusion and expectation was portrayed by the German Jewish exile, Erich Arendt. He was stationed at the front of the central clinic just at the moment when the Gaitanistas were demanding the fate of their leader. At the bottom of the image, you can see the smoke that comes from the house where the Ministry of Government worked. In the foreground, a crowd of men with machetes in hand, ready to unleash barbarism. When the death of Gaitán was confirmed, after 2 in the afternoon, the collective destruction was witnessed. The fires, looting, vandalization of business and shops, and revenge killing were the fatal outcome of that day. The Pila Shelef on Main Street of Bogota, the 6th and 7th Avenue, coincidentally where the Jewish trade was concentrated. The victim of the looting, almost entirely merchants, reached the amount of 640, among which 140 belonged to the Jewish community. Almost 22% of those affected were from a community that, at that time, had no more than 3,500 inhabitants in Bogota. For the losses for the community were substantial. According to the JDC archives, probably about 80% of the Jewish business property was destroyed, and particularly hard hit were the small Jewish merchants who practically lost everything they had. The narratives of the destruction were also documented by members of the community present in that day in the city. It's important to say that in that day were celebrate the Pan American Conference in Colombia, in specific in Bogota, and a Jewish community and Jewish delegation have a press in that moment. The journalists say, there is no store in Bogota, we was not completely plundered. The private homes have not fared much better. I am with the Jewish agency delegation in the above Hotel Continental with what I'm wearing. Yesterday, the boarding house in which I live was still okay. I was cold. My car has disappeared. I was standing before the building of the conference that is on an official errand and is no longer there. Feinberg has committed suicide in his burning store. Insurance are valueless. The Jewish colony, as far as I can see, is ruined. In a few hours of madness, millionaires have become beggars. The Jewish middle class is also probably ruined. I personally can hardly complain. Even though I have lost my new car, I have lost the money, which I had lent to friends, or at least have saved my life. Others who have family to support are really ruined, and I wonder how this country will recover from this fatal blow. This is other image about the destruction of Bogota that afternoon in April. Other picture image about the local business looting and vandalization in Bogota. Other image about the same thing. This testimony belong to the, sorry, I can't see. Okay, belong to the American witness who said something about this afternoon. Not a single store was intact. They had broken all the doors and windows, destroyed the furniture and utensils, and stole all the merchandise. And this from 25th Street on 19th Street, where we had to stop abruptly. From that point on, nothing remained but the green, blackened, and still burning shells of what only 24 hours before had been lined with the sum of the finest store in Bogota. Broken, naked mannequins lay about the street in grotesque positions. One of them hung in the middle of the streets, suspended from the streetcar wires, with the sign Viva el Liberalismo placed over the back of its neck, naked and mutilated. Another had fallen with his head against the wall of a destroyed warehouse, and seems to be crying, I guess, at the smoking ruins of the building that I had already collapsed, and filled the narrow street in the gloomy patch of the sky, visible through the skeleton of the roofless walls that still stood. The blackened shell of the streetcar that had been stopped there the previous afternoon, and I saw only ruins, devastation, and desolation. While we were still there, several of the walls collapsed, and we had to retreat hastily to avoid being crushed. It seems to me that this was not Bogota, but the field of the bombing of London or Warsaw. In a dismantled warehouse, I saw lying the body of a young Jew who had survived to entire war in Poland. He had arrived in Colombia only 4 months early. In this vain attempt to save the storehouse from the aunt who had brought him to America, he had been killed by looters. Other example that I found in the JDC archives is the press journal in Yiddish. The press is an Argentinian journal that Jewish community in Colombia tried to inform about the local situation. And they say, these distinguished friends from Argentina After the terrible days that the Jewish community of Bogota endured, we have been able to assess the tremendous damages suffered, and we believe it's necessary to inform Jews around the world what is the situation we are going through in a dramatic moment. And above all this, essential measure to be taken to rebuild community life in Bogota, which is where we have suffered the most. There are 4 Jewish lives lost in the event, 3 of which were buried in the Jewish cemetery. The 4th was a young man who has disappeared and who was probably buried in the large mass graves that were used in those days. The whole economic life of our community is now paralyzed and in complete bankruptcy. Even the large wholesalers had almost all their merchandise consigned to the businesses that were looted and burned. Consequently, we are facing a very serious problem. Many people are extremely discouraged. They are thinking of emigrating in a considerable numbers, which can tremendously affect our social and community life. This document was translated by a colleague and lovely friend, Israel Lotterstein. The other document that I want to share you is the list of the Jewish victims of the Bogotazo and general inventory of their material losses. We could see the names of the other sides, the amount in money quantity of their losses in that situation. Despite the destruction record, there are several confirmations that the attacks of the Jewish commerce do not have an anti-Semitic character. The attacks on the Jewish shop are not because any anti-Semitic feelings, but as part of the mob action against all shops. The Jews lost heavily because they were not insured against lost mob actions. However, the way they have to act before the Colombian authorities and the way they behave in public, according to reports, is what can generate hostile attitude towards Jewish. On April 15, a week after the riots, it is confirmed that the Colombian government is negotiating to contract international loans for reconstruction and aid to the victims. However, it's the same Jewish community that recognizes that is not the beneficiary of such aid. The state is interested in reconstructing the national economy and will give the best benefits to that commerce and those businessmen which are essential for the nation. The Jewish businessman is the intermediary businessman. Very few are importers. Therefore, the small Jewish businessman economic reestablishment will be made more slowly. And this small impoverished Jewish businessman, in order to be able to live, will go into the black market, competition, another activity which will serve to provoke anti-Semitism with the increasing unemployment, hunger, and poverty. The preventive road, therefore, is for us to do something to help them to reestablish their commercial economy. The instruction given to the community not only covered the economic order, austere and prudent conduct were also the ways to avoid anti-Jewish attitudes. Tomorrow, Saturday, there will be a meeting in the synagogue. They shall call upon those present to cooperate in putting the situation in order. I shall appeal to our co-religioners for a certain period not to appear in the street too well dressed, not to go riding too much in the automobiles which they can be able to save, not to indulge in speculation, thereby raising the prices, so as not to be arrested and not provoke anti-Semitic consequences. The call for modesty and parents not only remain in the recommendation, but by April 28th of that year, some anti-Jewish incidents were also reported in the city of Bogota. Some symptoms of antisemitism or rise of the insurrection are visible. For example, a gentlewoman in the market struck a German Jewish woman when she paid $5 for a chicken. As they struck her, the woman exclaimed, "You Jews have all our money. That is why you can pay black market prices." In addition, some Jews have been arrested in the anti-communist roundup. At least one innocent Jewish was arrested because the police discovered Yiddish correspondent in his files. Finally, it's feared that the one hand, unnecessary ostentation by those Jews who escaped relative unscathed, may create conditions for anti-Semitic manifestation. The events of April 9 find the Jewish community in Colombia in a great crossroads. On the one hand, the official partition of Palestine decreed by the United Nations provoked a great economic effort to raise money and aid to send to Israel. On the other hand, the beginning of the first Arab-Israel War, almost a month after the national incidents, May 15, 1948, stimulated a substantial immigration of young Colombian Jews, recognized that Colombia was not a safe place for the Jewish community. The document in the JDC archive say, being aware of the fact that present Jewish conditions here don't look very bright. 20 young persons among the revisionists got organized and are leaving for Palestine with about 2 weeks. Their preparation is full swing. 3 young veterans who left from Eretz Israel before the event set the example. They write enthusiastic letters which opened the eyes of the local Jewish youth and are for them great consolation. It is a fact that parents who before the riots did not want to give their consent to the departure of their children for Eretz Israel have changed their minds and agree that the children shall go and build for themselves alone a secure home. The other event, external event, and that weighed heavily of the local community was the fate of hundreds of thousands Jewish refugees located in displacement camps in Europe who were seeking a visa to enter Colombia. The only thing that the events of April 9th did was aggravate and delay the situation of hundreds of survivors who were waiting for instruction from consulate and diplomats abroad. The efforts to restore the economy of the community and the fact of not showing itself as a burden to the nation, as the joint document declared, were precise because Colombia did not have open-door migratory tradition with the Jews, neither before or after the war conflict. The effort for economic rebuilding would start with the assistance of the Jewish community in the United States, who would provide loans to the Jewish business in Colombia. This aid would also benefit Jewish survivors trying to enter into the country. If the American jury would start by intervening on behalf of its brother, we could gain a great moral benefit. The Colombians will see that the Jews are helping to resolve part of the economic problem of the country. The matter is even more serious because, as I have just been informed, the JDC has obtained 600 visas for Jewish DPS of Europe from Colombia. The 600 visas figure at stake was perhaps a response to the passive and diligent attitude to the local Jewish community concerning its tragedy in the events of April 9. It is unlikely that these visas have been granted at that effort to be not a burden to the nation had have had a positive effect on Colombians' immigration attitude. According to migration estimate, Colombia only received 1,200 Jewish refugees from Nazis after World War II. What remains to be clarified is whether April 9 and its consequent violence made this migration number so scarce, if not criminal. The last thing that I want to add to this lecture has to do with two methodological impressions made through interviews about the consequences of the Bogotazo on immigrants who arrived in Colombia at that time, or who were trying to immigrate and whose papers and procedures were made difficult by the events of the Civil War. The first one is from an interview conducted by me in 2013 with the son of the Polish survivor Jaime Bromberg, who lived in my hometown Manizales, Saul Bromberg. He arrived in Barranquilla and they had to stay on the ship for about 15 days. I replied, import, the Civil War here, the death of Gaitan. Did they receive them because of the political situation? Because of the political situation here in Colombia, when he arrived and managed to get off to the ship on his way to Bogota, he began to see hills of cadavers on the roads, the bodies. The second example involves an interview conducted by the Shoah Foundation in 1995, with a Czech survivor who described her attempt to come to Colombia just after the assassination of Gaitan. Anna Posi said, "We deserve to live, but where should we live? We have nobody in the world. But I found out a cousin was in Colombia, in Bogota, and he wrote to us, why don't you come to over here? And we say, yes, why not? He applied for a visa for us, and we applied for one way out of Czechoslovakia. It was connected. Once you got the permit to go out of the country, you went with this permit to the Colombia consulate and go to the visa. We go to the permit to get out of the country. My husband went to the consulate and the consulate was closed because there was a revolution in Colombia, which is not unusual. And the post office had burned down and our visas has burned. So we had to make another decision. With those two examples, I finish my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorena. Thank you for this presentation, and those last two slides with those testimonies are particularly striking, I think. We will now open the floor to questions and answers. And as a reminder, your microphones are turned off. So if you have questions, please send them via the Q&A function. And Lorena, I see that we already have some questions, which I will ask you. The first question is, how difficult was the migration to Colombia if you had family there?
How difficult was the migration if you already have family in Colombia? In some cases, it was a good exception that the family or relatives could bring and made an appeal. The most cases of the Jewish migration in the post-war period was by this process. Relatives called families in Europe, refugees in DPC camps, and this is the most successful way to arrive in Colombia.
After the war, and I think this is what the person says in the last slide that you show in the last testimony. I think that person said that she had family in Colombia, right?
Exactly.
This is where she wanted to come. How many Jews, this is the second question, how many Jews were living in Colombia by 1939? And from what countries were they originally from?
Okay, the numbers almost 10,000, but it's not a precise figure. And because this is so irregular, the immigration, and many of the cases declare other religion because the Catholic presence in Colombia, it was strong, and many Jews know about that. And when he could arrive to the ports of Barranquilla or Buenaventura, he preferred to say they are Catholics. And is for that reason, the number is difficult to have an exact figure. And there are other questions for that country. And
hold on. Yes, from what countries they originally came from? Yes.
Exactly. The most part of the Jews in Colombia before the war was Sephardic Jewish immigration. But the other part is Ashkenazi immigration from Poland, Belarus, and other countries. But one thing that I could find in this research, that a huge part of the immigration from Romanian and Italian Jewish, refugee Jews who want to come to Colombia because it was easy for them learn Spanish. And I try to trust this hypothesis because even in document of the JDC archives, I found many applicants and many reliefs aids to Bucharest, Romania, and that country who speak Romance languages. This other hypothesis that I in this moment.
I'm going to follow up a little bit on this question. You said that before the war, there was a number of immigrants who were Sephardic.
Yes, the most part of the Jews in Colombia were Sephardic before the war. Yes.
And where did they come from?
At least in the 20s, Sephardic, the first one, Libya, Morocco, and of course Spain, to the colonization of the largest process of the colonization in Colombia in the 4th, 5th, and 6th century. But the other countries that the Sephardi comes in the north of Africa and of the region of the Levante in the Middle East.
And did they come, which period did they come? Did they come in during the interwar period or even earlier than that?
The most part of the Sephardic community come before the war, and the other come in the mid part of the war, to the two war, the Great War and this World War II.
So a number of Sephardic Jews came to Colombia during World War II as well?
I don't remember, sorry.
No. I'm curious because I'm curious as to how the government would favor Sephardic Jews over Ashkenazi Jews because of the language, the common language and other things.
And they speak Ladino and it's more similar to Spanish. Yes,
exactly.
I'm sorry.
Okay. So another question that came to us, what was the influence of the Muslim Colombian community on the government's decision? Was there a significant?
No, I don't have any information about that. I could found some document about the Syro-Lebanese community that, of course, they were affected by the riots, by the violence. But if the Jewish community in Colombia is a few numbers, Muslim community is even less. And I don't find any information about the Muslim community and any information about that. We have only a president, Turbay, but he was not Muslim. He was Christian, Libyan Christian, but I don't have information about that.
What were the political tendencies among the Jewish community, and how were they affected by the breakout of La Violencia?
This is a hard question because as I could show you, 5 Jews were arrested by Colombia thought that they were communist. And because one of the hypotheses of the violence of the assassination of Gaitán in Colombia was confirmed as that a communist assassination. It was the part of the hypothesis. And many of the politicals and the police try to get some Jews, try to impose from them communist tendencies. But the most part of the Jews in Colombia at that time have a strong Zionist politic agenda. And for that reason, the most part of the fundraising, even in other documents that I found in the JDC archive, it was a struggle fighting against the most part of the Jewish community and specific Sephardic and revisionist communists to fundraise money to Palestine of the new state of Israel. This is the, if I can to describe a politic tendency in Colombia at that moment is a strong Zionist movement, not a communist or even a political local ideology. I can find those ideas.
How are the relationships between the existing Sephardic community and the new immigrants? Did you find anything about this?
Could you repeat, please?
How was the relationship between the existing Sephardic community and the new immigrants?
The relation, no, at least, of course, the Sephardic community asked some survivors in the north of Africa and the Middle East, but is some random documents about that the Sephardic community to have to try to rescue your survival, but it's short. It's really little documents about that.
If we have a more general question about the context, Lorena, did Colombia participate in World War II? Did they participate militarily? And so where in Europe against the Nazi? If you could tell us a little bit about the position of Colombia during the war.
Wow, this is a huge question. This is part of my doctoral research, but I try to explain. Colombia has not a military participation in the World War II, except one trial training in the US and the Pacific coast to see some activities and military activities, but no participating in an active way in the war. The participation in Colombia in the World War II was to the economic war. The first part was an economic war. And after to declare the broke relations between Germany and in Colombia, the diplomatic relation, Colombia declares as a ally to the United States in confront to the war. And Colombia assists the United States with economic measures, has to try to close the economic life in the German citizens and the Japanese and Italian citizens to reside in Colombia. That campaigns try to restrict her economy and confiscate their assets and blackmail and blacklist. And finally, Colombia had to immigrate internment concentration camp and in the borders of the big city of the Bogota. And in that place was incarcerate at least 100 German citizens and 11 Japanese citizens. But the most part of the role of the World War II in Colombia was strictly economic measures against the German, Japanese, and Italian citizens, no more.
Thank you, Lorena. I'll go back to questions about Jewish refugees. When Jews applied for visas to Colombia during the Second World War, why did they choose Colombia specifically? Did you find anything about that in your research?
Colombia, as other cases in Latin America, it not was a predilect place to immigrate, because the Jewish migration is small numbers. And of course, many Jews in Europe prefer to go to Argentina or, of course, United States. Colombia was an election because it was possible to pay a blackmail to get a visa in some cases. And the other reason, it was Colombia is in the middle of the continent. This is the center of the continent. And if eventually the Jewish immigrant could to move to other countries as well, Mexico, Argentina, or even United States, or many of them went to Colombia to waiting to United States visa. And for that reason, many Jews in Colombia who arrived before the war, waiting 10 years, maybe 15 years, to the United States government, appeal and accept the visa, and they re-emigrated eventually for the United States. The most part of Colombia is more a transit country than a migration country. And even is so common in other Latin American countries. Bolivia is other example, Venezuela, Cuba, and of course the political situation makes so difficult for Jews and other situations to be there. Other conditions were, of course, the impossibility to get couples, Jewish couples, and for the reason Jewish migrant to go to the United States to get that, or even more cultural opportunities and other reasons to not be, to the Jewish migration in Colombia not be a good place to stay, as many documents say.
So that's very interesting. So they went to Colombia as a transit to transit to a final destination, but they didn't ask for. Did Colombia offer transit visas, or?
As I say in the document, only for the people who had
final destination,
bordering to Colombia destination.
Right.
This is the only situation that Colombia grant to transit or tourist visa. And the most part of the people who had transit or tourist visa, that visa couldn't eventually become in a permanent resident in Colombia.
Well, so this brings us to the next question in a very natural way. What percentage of the Jewish population moved to other South American countries or to Palestine in 1948? Or I suppose to other South American countries that
I don't know, but the few data that I have is I know that some Colombians fought in the first civil war, in the Arabic and Palestinian war. And because I say this is considering the data of the April 9 to the riots before the assassination of Gaitán, at the same time, the first civil war in Palestine. But unfortunately, I don't have numbers. And I want to trust that because the most part of the Colombian Jews living of course, in Israel, and the second part, the population live in Miami. And it's a so interesting data that I want to trace. But of course, this research is wide opening, but it's a good question.
And we have another question about whether Jews immigrated from Israel to Colombia after 1948 and in the 1950s. So is there an immigration afterwards to Colombia after 1948 from Israel? Did you see any reference to that in your research?
It's possible, but I really don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't want to lie.
That's fair enough. And now we have another questions. Jews were offered visas to the Dominican Republic in the World War II period as part of the whitening effort. Was race involved in the decision to allow or reject Jewish refugees in Colombia?
Yes, the racial factor was important even more in the previous of the war, when so eugenistic theories were, of course, these ideas touch the political ideas in Colombia. And they refer that the Colombia needs whitening racial no, we have a racial problem. The political say our economic problems, not only for our unfortunate development, but for our racial composition. It was the statement. And for that reason, we prefer to receive better racial immigrants, and specific Germans, or but in the other case, Europeans, white Europeans come from two Catholic countries, in a specific Spain and Italy. And the racial arguments, of course, was a terrible burden of the Jewish immigration to try to come to Colombia. And it was part of these ideas in that situation, of course.
And I will ask one last question. What was the reaction to Gaetan's death in other cities of Colombia?
It was the same reaction. Even the more dramatic reaction in the rural areas was in Tolima and in the inner region of Colombia. And of course, all the riots, destroyed cities, looting and burning store was common in all the country. And of course, it was terrible, not only in 9 April, but 3 days before these events. And the losses was terrible in the commercial lives, and of course the problems of in the rural areas, the huge problem in Colombia at the time, of course, before it was the violence was produced in a huge way, in a terrible ways in the rural areas. But of course it was common, the anger reaction before the assassination of Gaetan.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Lorena. Thank you for taking the time to answer the questions. Thank you to our participants for joining us today and for sending some very interesting questions as well. The next JDC Archives program will take place on June 29. Dr. Jonathan Sizuk will give a lecture on Jewish religious life in Poland after 1968. The invitations were already sent out last week. You will also be able to register for the program via our JDC Archives Facebook page. And we hope again that many of you will be able to join us. Please sign up for our e-newsletter if you would like to be added to our mailing for public programs. And thank you all, and wishing everyone a very good week.
Thank you, Isabel. And thank you everyone for the questions and for the patience for my English.